Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Security Innovation and New Technology at American University. Welcome to our event tonight on strategy and cyberspace. Before we get going, many thanks to our speakers, who I'll introduce in just a minute, but also thanks to our staff for setting this up, especially Jess Regan and Kate O'Ryan for all of their work in getting these things put together. Turns out there can be complications that you don't expect. We do understand that there are some people who are trying to get into the room. There was an issue with the Eventbrite link. We'll hopefully have that squared away in just a minute so that everybody can get into the room and be a part of our discussion tonight. I should also say that if there's a continuing issue tonight, we are recording this lecture or this event, so we'll make it publicly available and you can go back and watch it at a later time. Last point of order, we will be under Chatham House rules tonight in the discussion, so you're free to discuss the content of the event, but please don't use the names of the speakers or their affiliations if you are discussing them publicly. Why are we here? Well, last year, US Cyber Command had its 10th birthday, and it has come a long, long way in that time. Originally a task force set up to defend military computer networks, it is now a unified combatant command with a very big mandate, quote, to direct, synchronize, and coordinate cyberspace planning and operations, to defend and advance national interest in collaboration with domestic and international partners. That's a mouthful, and there's a lot included in that phrase, right? How you define that mission statement, I think, says a lot about where you see the purpose of Cyber Command and its mission heading forward. Now, Cyber Command's growth, of course, has occurred alongside the extraordinary expansion of cyberspace itself. The digital domain is interwoven not just in military operations, but into our social and economic and political affairs. There's no escaping it at this point. Not surprising then that Cyber Command has an increasing number of dilemmas to consider. Indeed, think of some of the biggest events of the last few years: election defense, foreign hacks against American domestic firms. These are front page issues, and they seem far removed from a narrow focus on defending military networks. What's the nature of these challenges? Should the command be responsible for responding to them? And if so, how? More broadly, how should we think about national security in cyberspace? These are the issues that occupy a new book, 10 years in, Implementing Strategic Approaches to Cyberspace. This is a new book which has been published by the Naval War College, which is available on its website for free download. That website was attached to your Evite link, and it's easy to find. Just Google 10 years in Naval War College and you can find it. I'm told there's already been over 2,000 downloads, so it's getting quite a lot of attention. I'm not at all surprised by that, given the quality of the editorial staff and the authors who participated. We're lucky enough to have two of the editors of that book here tonight, as well as two of the authors involved. Dr. Erica Borghard is a resident senior fellow with the New American Engagement Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Recently, she served as senior director and task force lead for the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Dr. Nina Kollars is associate professor of the Strategic and Operational Research Department of the Naval War College and a core faculty member in the Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute. Dr. Jacqueline Schneider is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and a non-resident fellow at the Naval War College. She was also a senior policy advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Dr. Michael Warner, finally, serves as command historian of US Cyber Command, where I believe he's been more or less since the beginning. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that.
That's correct.
So he's in an ideal position to provide us with a historical overview of where the command has come from and how it's got to this place. So what we'll do tonight is we will go, we'll start with Dr. Warner. and provide that context. And then we'll move alphabetically with Erica Borghard, Nina Kollars, and Jackie Schneider. This will leave plenty of time in the Q&A. For those of you at home who have questions, please enter them in the Q&A bar, and please type them in as they occur to you, and then we will get to them when we get to Q&A. If that sounds okay to everybody, I will now turn it over to Dr. Rovner.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Josh. So I was one of the co-editors on this volume, and I was very pleased with the way that it turned out. There are no clinker chapters in there. Everything in there is of a fairly consistently high grade. There are a couple of chapters that I think are on subjects that might seem a little bit prosaic, but are actually breakthroughs in what we can discuss in public. In particular, the one on cyber defense and on the one on the readiness of teams. Those are topics that really aren't discussed all that much. And I think we really add to the public knowledge of those things and how they're working in cyberspace. But all the chapters are good in this one. My own chapter is on sort of the character and really the evolution of cyber conflict, and why it is that there's a cyber command in the first place. I do less on the history of Cyber Command and its evolution. I touch on that, but really I'm sort of looking at the context for Cyber Command and that path that it has followed there. So I'm happy to talk about developments within the command as well. I am speaking, of course, in my own capacity here. I'm not as an official representative of Cyber Command, so if my views are my own, and if you're wondering what the official command position is on anything, I can refer you either to the Public Affairs Office, or we can take that question for the record and get back with a more definitive answer. So what I found, I arrived at Cyber Command just 2 days before it stood up, just before it went, before it was created by Secretary Gates in 2010. And I've met a lot of the people who have led it since then. And some of these people I worked with as they were captains or colonels, and it's been sort of great to see their career path. So what I found when I arrived is that the histories, really weren't any histories. There was no secondary literature for me to look at. There is now beginning to be a secondary literature, and it gets better each year as there's a growing community of interested in cyber history. And what I found was that cyber is a venue for force. It's a place where people create and store value, but no one had really charted the ways in which nations looked at that and decided that they wanted to build power and the ability to exert force in this new venue, and then what dynamics that caused with other nations. Now, there were an enormous number of journalistic treatments of that. There was a little bit of memoir literature. There were plenty of people walking around who could tell you their particular aspect of it there, but there was no scholarly literature on it. And so I hope that I've done a modest a bit to try to remedy that situation there. So I will do a very fast summary of that history winding up to the present day. This is a horseback survey done at breakneck speed, but I want to put some themes on the table here because I think we're going to be coming back to these in later discussion here. Really, in essence, the ways in which we as a command, as a military, as an intelligence community, as a government have sort of thought our way into this space, a space in which we want to use military operations to make things happen in cyberspace. This is a path that began 50 years ago, even longer than that. People are starting to think about this here. And it has been a series, and just to be absolutely blunt here, it has been a series of wrong guesses for about the last 50 years. We have consistently thought that this thing that we're looking at is evolving in a certain way, And it turns out it was evolving in a different direction here. And this is not because people weren't thinking very hard about this. There's been some wonderful brain power at work on this. It's just that it's a new technology. It's very dynamic. It is fast-paced. And there's really no human power that could sort of guess everything that was going to happen. So the guesses come out wrong over and over again. We thought in the 1970s, for instance, that the threat to our computer security was primarily an insider threat. It was an internal thing. It was, how do you guard the computers, which are down in the basement anyway? How do you guard them from somebody, some user, some operator who has too much access and a motive to do something nefarious with them? In the 1980s, if you saw the movie War Games, that shifts, and we realize that people can come down a wire, down a network into those computers. And so we start focusing on not just the insider threat, but also the ability of hackers to get in. They're not all high school students like Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy. There can potentially be foreign governments as well. That is beginning to be seen in the mid-1980s. In the 1990s, we realize we have suddenly made our society is now dependent on this thing called the internet. That happened before most people knew what the internet was. There was one senator who described it as a whole collection of tubes. And this is just sort of stunning in the way in which our military suddenly learned that it had to depend on something that very few people in the military really understood at all. At this point, we are really worried that some hackers, some terrorists are going to get laptops and attack our critical infrastructure, because after all, our critical infrastructure is now interneted. And anybody with a laptop can attack it. This is when we're building up the idea of homeland security. In the 2000s, after 9/11, we are very focused on the terrorist threat. Of course, that doesn't go away. What we find is the terrorists use the internet differently than what we thought. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, they're using the internet for recruitment, for control of operations, for fundraising, for propaganda. They're not attacking our critical infrastructure. So we have to adjust to that. At the same time, we're finding that states that had dabbled in cyber operations and cyber exploitation in the late 1990s are now going at it at full scale. We have people complaining, the Western world has people complaining about Chinese cyber espionage in public as early as 2005, 2006. And this seems to be increasing on a massive scale. We get very interested again in our critical infrastructure and the ability of people to touch it in the early 2010s. But this time we're worried about states doing that as well. As briefers from Cyber Command used to say when the command was standing up, we were worried first about exploitation, then we worried about disruption, now we're worried about destruction. So meanwhile, what is happening here? Several dictatorial regimes are also finding that cyberspace is a threat to them. They're worried about it in a very, very different way. They're worried about Western apps, websites, news sources, social media, and so forth. They are very, very worried that things like Google and YouTube and Facebook represent an existential threat to their regimes. The Arab Spring seems to verify and solidify this fear. And what you have after the Arab Spring, the early 2010s, is a series of states starting to sort of reach out and touch the West through cyber operations here. And then by 2015, 2016, it's becoming clear that we're not going to be able to deter this anymore, and that states can touch each other, can reach out and touch each other in three particular sources of state power here, which is to say their intellectual property, how it is that they create and store wealth, the privacy and security of their citizens, and finally, the legitimacy of the government in the eyes of its citizens its allies, and its creditors as well here. And so all of these things are now at risk in cyberspace. So to wrap up here, where does Cyber Command fall in this? Cyber Command has not been immune to its way of partaking in some of these wrong guesses here. We have not always been we've been surprised by events. Let me put it that way. What was a sort of turning point for us in Cyber Command and the U.S. government as well was the 2016 election. We saw that a foreign government is able to affect the legitimacy or the perception of the legitimacy of the results of that. We're also able to work in to build cyber operations to attack ISIS online, and some of these have been discussed publicly here. We're also able to build operations to defend the legitimacy of our elections in the midterms in 2018, and again in the presidential elections in 2020 there. So what we've done, we as a government, as a command, we have sort of recognized where we've got to in cyberspace. We have sort of recognized that we are not the only driver of events in the dynamic in cyberspace. And we have tried to adapt to that, again, to be able to build military operations at scale to protect our own networks in cyberspace and to be able to affect others to preserve our own security and to perhaps make them think a little bit more about what it is that they want to do to us in cyberspace. So I'll stop there. Be pleased to answer questions at any point, but I think we're holding those for later on.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I'm glad that a lot of people are now able to get into the room. So I'll just remind everybody who is here now that we are taping this. And so this will be publicly available so that if you missed anything at the outset, don't worry, you can go back later and hear it again. And please, as you think of questions for our panelists, please type them into the Q&A chat bar so that we can have some ready for when the formal presentations are done. With that, I'm going now to turn it over to Dr. Erica Borghard.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here tonight with my co-authors and co-panelists and Solarium colleagues. So I guess, tonight I will be talking about my co-authored book chapter for this volume with Sean Lonergan, who also happens to be my husband. So I guess couples who write together, I don't know, we'll see. But our chapter focuses on public-private collaboration in cyberspace. And we focus on sort of two elements within the private sector because, of course, the private sector is quite a broad area. So we focus on those entities in the private sector that sort of directly contribute to national defense, and that's defense critical infrastructure and the defense industrial base. And then we also talk about the critical infrastructure that underlies our economy and our way of life. And just by way of some background, we kind of had been working on sort of different elements of what ultimately is in this chapter for quite some time. The inspiration really came out of kind of a dovetailed experience that we both sort of had in our careers. I was at West Point for 3 years teaching and then left to be an international affairs fellow at CFR. And during that time, I split my fellowship year between JP Morgan Chase, working on the global cyber partnerships and government strategy team, and then at Fort Meade on the Cyber National Mission Force. And what was really exciting about that was I kind of got to see the evolution of this model of public-private collaboration that is a step beyond the information sharing that had been sort of the go-to for quite a number of years. And I got to sort of see that develop in terms of one of the biggest actors in the financial sector, JP Morgan, and then Cyber Command, and figuring out how to sort of work together to get a better understanding of what the threat landscape really looks like, and and how the critical stakeholders involved can sort of overcome a lot of inherent barriers and silos to do a better job of working together. And at the same time, Sean was on active duty and assigned to Fort Meade at the CNMF. And so we both kind of saw different aspects of this challenge, and it really informed our thinking in this book chapter. So what we do in this chapter is we both provide an overall strategic framework that guides, that we think should guide thinking about how to address what really are shared threats in cyberspace that both elements in the private sector and the government face. Sort of we think that we advocate for using resilience as that strategic framework, and then we provide some recommendations for what this could look like in practice and how to implement it. And the reason we kind of focus on resilience as the framework really comes down to three sort of reasons. The first has to do with overall patterns in international balance of power. The second has to do with lessons learned about defense in cyberspace. And then the third has to do with the role of deterrence. So first, when it comes to the international balance of power, both in economic terms and in military terms, we've seen a clear and sort of decisive shift in the relative balance of power away from the United States, such that other actors can pose a credible challenge to the US. And a lot of people would argue that this shift happened in cyberspace almost before it kind of became manifest in other domains. But regardless, there are links between how threat actors behave in and through cyberspace and sort of other domains with important implications for what we all now call great power competition. So basically what actors do in cyberspace can have broader strategic implications. This is most clearly apparent when it comes to adversary threat activity against the defense industrial base, right? This could be for the purpose of stealing intellectual property about American weapon system to either replicate them or inform the development of offset capabilities, or to hold these systems at risk potentially for a crisis or conflict advantage. But we also see this against critical infrastructure more broadly, where adversaries are able to leverage the fact that the US economy and way of life really depend on the secure, reliable functioning of information and communications technology. And so taken together, this means that disruptions in cyberspace to critical infrastructure are sort of an inevitable reality. We have to essentially assume compromise, assume disruption, and that's sort of one of the ways where resilience fits in. The second reason we argue for a resilience framework is because cyber defenses are inherently imperfect. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of, the offense-defense balance in cyberspace. That conversation has been had way too many times. But I think we can all agree that, a well-resourced, dedicated, patient adversary can almost always overcome defenses and gain access to critical networks and potentially deliver disruptive effects, which means that defense is inherently imperfect. And so that gets back to that assumption about sort of assuming that disruptions will take place and defense is imperfect. And then the final reason why sort of we think that resilience is important is because deterrence is imperfect. And again, lots of ink has been spilled about deterrence in cyberspace, but what many of my colleagues have demonstrated in a lot of their research is that deterrence has actually held at higher thresholds, right? At strategic cyber attack or thresholds of violence, which I'm sure Jackie could talk about at length in Q&A. But there's also this non-trivial set of malicious behavior that doesn't rise to that threshold that would trigger, U.S. retaliation with across the full spectrum of credible response options, and this makes deterrence difficult. So again, we're back to this reality of disruption and compromise happening on more of a routine basis. So we can't defend against everything, we can't prevent everything, then that suggests that we need to adopt a sort of resilience-based mindset to anticipate those disruptions and invest some allocate some portion of resources and being better prepared for them. And so, so what's resilience, right? It's basically that. It's having the capacity to anticipate, prepare for, withstand, and rapidly recover from, and also learn in the wake of disruptive events. And so reorienting around resilience means being realistic about the probability that adverse events will happen, and then making appropriate investments in strategic threat intelligence and readiness, rapid recovery. And in cyberspace, this is the key part and the focus of our chapter, that has to involve the private sector as a key stakeholder, not only because private actors own and operate most of the infrastructure. This is that statistic that we've heard ad nauseum, and I'm actually not sure if it's true that 85% is the number, but there you have it. But the private sector also is a target of threat actors for strategic purposes, and often it's the same threat actors who target both the government and elements in the private sector for their own reasons. And so we kind of organize our recommendations around sort of 4 core pillars of resilience that get at they get back to how I defined it just a moment ago. So the first is anticipation, which is basically better intelligence. And the private sector has to play a role here, which is challenging, and I can talk about that in Q&A. But both the government and the private sector have shared threats, but they're also only seeing one piece of the threat picture, right? As adversaries are targeting across different entities, across sectors, across the government, any given stakeholder only sees like whatever little piece that's happening on their networks, and potentially information that's shared through sort of information sharing organization, ISACs and things like that. But that's, I would say, relatively minimal. And so, that sort of siloed picture is less salient when it comes to the DoD and the defense industrial base, because you have sort of more inherent and easier means of sharing information, especially across classification lines. But with critical infrastructure, it's really challenging. Another challenge too, in terms of getting at better anticipation, is that public-private collaboration has to take place on a more sort of routine basis, more proactively rather than reactively. And so when we think about when the government, like when is it triggered that the government comes in, right, to sort of play a role in this sort of public-private collaboration? Typically, we think about PPD 41, and that means that a cyber incident has to have reached some critical threshold. But the reality is that if you want to do a better job of anticipating future disruptions, then you're that ship has already sailed if you're in that world. So ideally, you would want to have a more strategic approach to intelligence collection, to have meaningful early warning. And for that to be meaningful, the private sector has to play some role, both in shaping intelligence collection requirements and also ideally in co-located analysis, where private sector stakeholders play some kind of a role, because there's context that they can bring to the table that the government simply doesn't understand or appreciate. So that's the first. The second pillar is preparation. And this mostly entails the development of playbooks and the exercising of playbooks, both within sectors and across sectors, that are developed around likely scenarios, which are informed by better intelligence collection. And these playbooks can serve important roles like clarifying roles and responsibilities in the event of a cyber incident. They can inform investments in defensive efforts. They could, put on paper and make more credible potential response options under certain conditions, to get buy-in for that, before an incident rather than during one or after the fact. So that's preparation. And then the final 2 pillars are sort of withstanding and recovering from a disruptive event if it takes place, which is sort of when you implement those playbooks that you've developed. And then finally, and this is often, I think, overlooked when we talk about resilience, is sort of learning and adapting after disruption. And so the process is really cyclical. So the information that you learn, both from exercising playbooks and also actually implementing them if something happens, then feeds back into your intelligence collection and your scenario development and your playbooks and so on. And so that's kind of the, very broadly speaking, the vision of public-private collaboration with the resilience framework that we lay out in the book chapter. Obviously, there are lots of impediments to this. This is an idealized version of what this all could look like. A major impediment is how to involve the private sector, especially in the anticipation pillar when it comes to intelligence collection and analysis. There also may be potential issues with the fact that there aren't necessarily market incentives for private actors to invest in resilient and redundant capabilities. So the government may need to think about how to address that sort of market gap. But I am hopeful because, and this isn't to sort of pat the Solarium Commission on the back, but we started thinking about this before the commission got stood up, and I do think that they pushed the ball forward a lot in terms of thinking about how to operationalize public-private collaboration and the importance of resilience. So I think it will be interesting to see how these results play out over time, especially with the new administration and in the next upcoming NDAA cycle. And so I'm looking forward to see what happens on that front.
Thank you very much, Dr. Borghard. Our next speaker is Dr. Nina Kollars. Over to you.
Thank you, and I share the same excitement with my other colleagues on the Zoom call today that we just haven't seen each other for a long time, and so it's just really good to see everyone together. And so I think most of, aside from my prepared remarks this evening, I think what you're going to hear a lot of that everyone's going to be talking about are sort of two major puzzles that come with dealing with cyber technologies and the threats therein, both domestically and then to our military. And the first one is just trust. Who do you trust and how do you get there, right? And so, and early on, I think there was a lot of confidence that we could technologically find our way to trust, right? We could find a way to secure a network or find a way to secure a computer system. And steadily we began to understand that no, this trust is actually a lot more complicated. And because we're so densely interconnected, thinking about trust really requires all kinds of acrobatics that I think, honestly, a whole second set of books could be written about just specifically on trust and cyber conflict. The second thing that you're going to hear a lot about probably in this conversation, and if not, then we're not doing our job, is about partnerships. And you heard a little bit in Erica's comments, and you heard a little bit of when Mike Warner was talking about the evolution of cyber, which is that there are no easy partnerships, no natural partnerships. The well-established sort of routes of DoD don't exactly enjoy the awkwardness of having to partner with the private sector. Certainly something that's and the private sector certainly is made uncomfortable by partnering with DoD, depending on where you are and what sector you're in. And so the chapter that I worked with, Peter Dombrowski, who isn't here tonight, he's a phenomenal scholar, more oriented toward political economy. I myself more oriented toward military innovation. And we wrote the chapter together. And one of the things we wanted to talk about in the chapter was this thing called the National Security Innovation Base, which is actually a subset. So the 2018 National Defense Strategy laid down its 11 defense objectives. And in that, they included establishing an unmatched 21st century National Security Innovation Base, or NSIB, that effectively supports the department, its operations, and sustains security and solvency. And so really what we're talking about, because NSIB is a very broad umbrella term, mostly what we focus on in our chapter is the Silicon Valley private sector. So Erica's comments were about sort of how we as a nation can partner effectively to create a more robust defense. I cannot say enough, creating a more robust defense is something we should be focusing on. But Silicon Valley private sector as a provider of capabilities to DoD is mostly what our chapter is about. And so what's interesting about and what's challenging about this is, as a nation, not just the DoD, but as a nation, the private sector is part of our ICT, our information communications technology comparative advantage. We're comparatively advanced in sophistication, the maturity of the marketplace. It's part of what keeps the United States relevant in the global marketplace. We're a service provision country. We have moved away from metal bending, right? And so this is such a huge part of our just plain old domestic economy. And also, right, we also need access. The DoD needs access to those products and services that are provided by Silicon Valley. So, so a successful implementation of this strategy means dealing with the hardware and software that both enable and frustrate the relationships that we try and have with the private sector. What the Biden administration really needs to focus on in ensuring a healthy and secure NSIB, right, at least must at some level align toward the DoD's strategy and the DoD's needs. That's just how we've got to figure out how to get the private sector aligned. Not the whole thing, but we need to sort of figure out how to pair effectively. How do we get to trust and how do we get to effective partnerships? So like historically, conventionally, the DoD could rely on the production base, the domestic production base of the United States, right? So how do we create tanks, and how do we create automobiles? How do we create the airplanes that the DoD needed? That came straight from the United States. We sort of turned to the metal bending industries. It's not, that alignment is not so clear anymore, and so this is creating a series of frustrations or puzzles that we sort of need to work on, right, to really get to a better match or a better alignment with the private sector. So the first part of the trick, and Jackie Schneider knows this all too well, the part of the trick is acquisition reform. So just maintaining the Department of Defense's technological advantage requires culture shifts, industry shifts, and just new thinking about how the Department of Defense pairs or partners, right, with its private sector. The challenge is also about innovation, and not just innovation as we think of like nuclear weapons or as we think of like building a new tank, but innovation at the pace of code change, right? So the pace at which code change is insane, and we have to think about how does the DoD innovate at that pace? And it's very much outside the wheelhouse. It requires changes to industry, investment in resources, and I think Cyber Command is only now achieving some of that independence and agility to work on its software. The third puzzle is going to be just plain old, as Erica was talking about, public-private partnerships, right? So one of the tricks is we have to realize that our private sector is the leader, not the DoD, in driving these capabilities. In creating these cyber capabilities, it is the private sector that pushes it. And even when it's not the private sector that creates the capability, it is the private sector that produces all the commercial software and hardware that everybody uses that then generates the vulnerabilities. And so even if we're far out ahead in learning how to attack in cyber weaponry, we still have to deal with the fundamental truth that is the private sector that is creating the foundation, the spaces in which all these fights take place. And then finally, and to be clear here, even though the United States is the most sophisticated globally, right? This is our service. ICT is where we are strong. Best isn't always important. And I did see somewhere in the participants there, Dr. Arthur Cronin, and it is the case that these kinds of capabilities are leveraged just as easily, maybe not as well, maybe not as beautifully, but just as easily by non-state actors as it is by states. And what comes at a heavy price at the outset for DoD to implement can just as quickly be picked up and implemented by non-state actors. And so we have this really interesting racing dynamic where even if we do manage to step ahead, our adversaries, poor and wealthy alike, can catch up. And so it's a good puzzle. And I think, I have optimism, again, not so much in the technology, but again, figuring out what partnerships will matter and how do we get to trust. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that. And our last speaker is Jackie Schneider. Over to you.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me. We're enjoying a warm, beautiful day in California with no risk of mudslides or fires today. So I really want to thank you for convening this. A few years ago, when we started this project, I was on the phone with Michael Warner and Emily Goldman, and I said, let's do an edited volume on strategy. And all the chapters could be different approaches to strategy. And Emily was like, no, We've been doing that. Somebody needs to finally write about how you actually implement strategy. And so I have to give Emily like tons of kudos because this book is not about debating different strategic approaches. In fact, it takes as an assumption great power conflict. And then it says, look, Cyber Command's been working for 10 years. It now has a strategic priority. How does it implement on all these different levels? So this is, because of that, each of these chapters is really exciting. I came to this project, I was a professor at the Naval War College, but I was also a reservist at Cyber Command. I've had the ignominious, achievement of serving 6 years as a reservist at Cyber Command, and that is about to come to a close in 3 days. But I knew what it felt like to have a strategy written and then get handed an LOE and say, you have LOE 3.4, now figure out how to implement it. And how important it was that not only does the strategy communicate something to our adversaries or Congress or other portions outside of the DoD, but that it communicates something to the people who actually implement strategy within the DoD. So I think of my strategy as my chapter as an implementation chapter. And so my focus was on cyber and talent, which was a key component in both the defense strategy and the national cyber strategy. Now, I am an academic, so I couldn't make this solely do these recommendations chapter. And I decided instead to look at history and look at how the history of manpower and war actually gives us some sort of clues about how we should be thinking about cyber and what is unique and what is not. So I got to start the chapter with a little discussion about the longbow. And I think the longbow is a really relevant historical analogy. We hate historical analogies at this point, but stay with me for a second. Okay, so the longbow was thought of as one of the first real military revolutions. And it was the development of this is a long bow that was very accurate. But the problem with the longbow was not the creation of the bow itself, it was the creation of the archers. It's a very, very difficult weapon to handle. And so during that same time period, the kings and queens had to think, okay, I've got this longbow, how do I build my inventory of archery specialists? So they, invested in training. And then when they couldn't train enough soldiers or archers, they invested in increasing the talent within the society by financing tournaments, by giving financial incentives for people to become experts at the longbow, by creating new laws that allowed public civilians to own the longbow. So the focus there was on developing this really small group of people at the time that could use this emerging technology effectively. Now, then the Gunpowder Revolution comes around. And suddenly with the advent of gunpowder, we don't have to be so skilled in the use of our weaponry because you have a much larger bang. So the focus instead became within these societies, not on developing specific skills, but instead on recruiting larger armies and then using drill and internal training in order to really increase the amount of manpower that you need for those kinds of wars. Now that really kind of had a zenith with the big citizen armies of levy en masse. And when you're pulling from the citizenry, you're taking the farmers, you're taking the shopkeepers, and you're giving them a weapon and saying, hey, you got to go to war. You don't have that luxury to have really difficult to use technology. So once again, the focus becomes on drill. Now, with the advent of World War I and World War II, we see the rise of technology in combat. And we see a rise of technologists. I mean, by the end of World War II, you have scientists that are basically, making the difference between what states are winning and losing, whether they're rocket scientists or they're Alan Turing or they're breaking code. And so you also saw kind of this role of civilian scientists that became a really, really important to how states win. And that just has increased since World War II to now. As we become more digitally enabled and more reliant on even more complex technologies, we move to a much more elite workforce, a much more skilled and talented workforce. And so we are definitely in the longbow model, just to take the analogy to the end. We are longbow, not gunpowder. And so when the DoD is thinking about its investments in training, recruitment, and retention, they have to realize that their biggest wins are going to be in recruiting and retention and not necessarily in training, because it's just a lot harder to create that kind of expertise from within the military services. Okay, so why do we need this specialized talent now? Well, if you're tuning in here today, you believe cybersecurity is important, but the reality is that even if you don't think cybersecurity is important, all the digitally enabled technologies that are throughout our battlefield say that cybersecurity is important. And when it comes to great power competition and something that looks more and more like coercion or conflict that doesn't actually have a significant amount of violence, you see more and more use of these digital technologies and more sparring within cyberspace in order to convince states that they are more or less likely to succeed if they were to go to some sort of violent conflict. Here's the problem for the US, probably the problem for most countries, is there is a real cyber talent shortage. So not only is it because we're competing with the commercial sector, which pays more, is generally more flexible, usually is working with the coolest and best technology, but also because we've created kind of difficulties in bringing these individuals into the Department of Defense. So you take an already small pool, and then you say, hey, if you've smoked marijuana, not interested. Or we say, hey, you worked in Silicon Valley, you know tons of foreigners, not interested, right? So we take our segment of a workable population and we just cut them down little by little. So it's really, really hard to get somebody who's very talented, willing to work for less, and then fits all of the, is able to jump all the hurdles to get into the DoD. And that's really, as a civilian, getting them into the military force is even more difficult because we have a series of physical requirements for our military workforce. So, if you have had asthma as a child, nope, going to be hard to get in. If you have problems with your arches, there's a series of different kind of maladies that may have been really important in the Korean War, but maybe wouldn't be a big factor in military effectiveness today, that are really keep a lot of individuals from being able to join. And then once they do join, you have physical fitness requirements, which generally are focused on the service requirements and not what we call the specialty requirements, the MOS, what you're actually doing. So there's a baseline of skills. And when I was a officer back in the day, many years back in the day, I led a very elite group of technical airmen, and it was a real misfortune that we lost quite a few of those because they couldn't pass their physical fitness test, like highly proficient, but they couldn't pass the test. So that's something that we've talked about in the past, but really have not been any significant changes. In fact, the Army has gone to an even harder physical fitness test. It's also gotten rid of age and gender denotations. So everyone has to kind of meet the same standard. And then they, instead of saying, oh, you're cyber, you don't have to do that, it's, oh, you do the minimum. And then for other people like infantry, you do more. So, and I know this is a really big debate, but it's an idea about kind of what we think the future warrior looks like. And if you think the future of war is carrying a rucksack through the mountains of Korea, then agreed, right? But if we're talking about great power competition and we're giving the authorities to actually conduct counter cyber operations or offensive cyber only to military members, then do we really care what all of those physical fitness standards? Maybe we could use some different physical fitness standards. So that's a polemic that I bring up there. There are a series of current initiatives that the DoD has started. The Cyber Accepted Service, there's direct commissioning. Some of the various services have started new aptitude batteries for cybersecurity. And then the DoD relies very heavily on the NSA Centers of Academic Excellence to generate a larger talent pool. But y'all, it is not enough. And I have yet to meet more than one person who has had been able to be hired within a few weeks with the Cyber Accepted Service. So we're still not bringing in as much talent as we really need to. So a few ideas on my part. One is just the expansion of reserve service in general, just to create more flexible options. That can be the expansion of the military reserve to include a more strategic reserve. But it also means creating and thinking about allowing civilians the right to serve, maybe in some sort of reserve capacity. And in general, we need more flexible ways for people to come in and out of both military and civilian service within the Department of Defense. And part of making that easier is the hiring process. And part of making that easier is thinking about like security clearances and how people are able to manage both their civilian and their DoD lives. And then finally, we need to just increase the overall capability in this country to work on cybersecurity issues. And that it's not all technology, right? We definitely need to increase the amount of cybersecurity technical expertise we have in this country, but we also need to invest in those that are able to take that technical expertise or an understanding of the technical and pair it with legal policy and more humanities, so that we can have people who are doing really wonderful things on the operational and tactical side, and also have those translating those to kind of strategic policy or legal successes. So I'm sure we'll have more questions about that, but thanks for letting me talk a little bit about that chapter, Josh.
Absolutely. Thank you all for wonderful presentations. We already have a nice queue of questions lined up, but I'm going to take the prerogative and ask one of my own to the group. I was struck by Mike Warner's short history of strategy in cyberspace as a series of bad bets, right? One after the other, one big one every decade seems to be the pattern. So you all have, in your chapters, have honed in on specific issues that you think are particularly important, right? We have resiliency in Erica Borghard's case. We have innovation for Nina, which is also dealing with public-private interaction. We have personnel issues, which are enormously important in Jackie's chapter. And Mike Warner talks about sort of what threats do we think are most important? Like, how do we conceptualize these domains? So I want to ask, what kind of bad bets do you worry about in your particular issue that you focused on for this research? Like for Jackie, what's a bad bet with personnel policy? For Nina, what's a bad bet for stimulating innovation and so forth? So whoever wants to have at it first, have at it.
I'll take it. I think a bad bet on the manpower is to try and make changes specific to cyber without tackling the overarching manpower issues that are going on, whether it's flexible promotion systems or thinking through flexible workforce, or, oh my gosh, health insurance for our military and civilian personnel, making that easier, making technology, the technology for administration, whether it's logging your hours or logging your travel or getting the government to pay for your travel. If we don't solve these bigger problems that affect the entire force, it won't matter what you do to like try and hire more cyber people. Those people are going to get frustrated and they are going to leave the force. So that would be my hope, is that we have larger personnel and then basic tech admin. I mean, Michael is probably nodding, and Nina, because they're both current DoD civilians, and so they have to live this every day of their life. I thank God we don't have to do that anymore. But that would be my input.
Very good. Mike, go ahead, Nina.
Oh, so I have two. I mean, this innovation is a really sore spot, and Erica and Jackie, everyone here at some point has to sort of think about innovation, just because we're talking about future capabilities, and so naturally future capabilities, we have to sort of talk about innovation. But there are two sort of fundamental confusions that people have about DoD innovation and cyber innovation. And one of them is that we have to make blind bets on everything. Like some sort of weird blanket buzzword bingo where it's like, well, if we just invest broadly in innovation, suddenly that will help DoD get better. And that's just, it's a really ridiculous assumption. And one of the things that I beg of our leadership is identify. I know it's hard to decide what you want to do, right? But we have a grand strategy, we have a national security strategy, we have a defense strategy. Identify clearly what it is you're trying to do, and then make those investments there. Think about innovation as narrowly construed and not simply as the gamut of software and hardware globally. It's an irresponsible investment. The second thing that I think that we make fundamental mistakes when we think about acquisition and innovation is we spend a lot of time thinking about down and in, what happens, who do we invest with within the United States, our domestic partnerships. We spend almost no time, because it's really hard, but we spend almost no time thinking about innovation and our international partners and allies, right? So if our partners and allies are vulnerable, then we're equally as vulnerable. And so we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how does the rest of the world, how do the rest of our partners and allies pair with us, not just information sharing, but just all the way down to the software and hardware level. Is there interoperability? Because if there isn't, we can multi-domain all over the place, and our partners and allies won't come with us. And so just thinking carefully about what is it we're doing with our partners and allies is going to fundamentally make innovation easier.
I could chime in on my bad bet, if that's okay. So, yeah, so I think that I think a bad bet in the context of resilience is framing the choice as between doing like either more defense or more offense. And I think that's a lot of times how I see the conversation play out around sort of debates about cyber strategy. And I think that's probably a legacy of how we talk about deterrence, whether it's deterrence by sort of punishment and cost imposition, or deterrence by denial, which people associate with defense. And what that leaves you, I think, is with sort of unpalatable choices when, you know, defense isn't perfect and you can't fight your way out of everything. And so that's why I think this is not a long-winded way of me saying that resilience is the right framework, but it basically is. So I think the bad bet is framing it as that, as a choice between, you know, defense versus offense, and not thinking about sort of that the Venn diagram where they don't overlap, right? Where neither defense nor offense is sufficient, and then you have to be able to withstand, recover, and learn from the disruptions that do happen.
All right, so I'm the caboose on the train here. My bad bet would be to think or start getting oneself in the habit of believing that cyberspace is sort of this large amorphous thing, and we have threats from all over the place, and we really need to focus on those threats, focus on those vulnerabilities, without realizing, without understanding that it really is only a handful of states, really only 4 that we're thinking about here, plus a couple of multinational violent extremist organizations that cause a great deal of the problems that we see in cyberspace. You know, obviously there are many cyber criminals out there. There are many different actors in cyberspace. There are countries they're squabbling with each other in cyberspace. But really, the strategic actors that concern us in the United States, that really can threaten us in the United States, that really can threaten our allies and do grave harm to our interests in cyberspace, really they reduce down to a handful of countries, and there's an ideological motivation or an ideological divide between us and them in every single one of these cases here, and that we need to be able to keep that front and center. We need to be able to be thinking about that as we think through larger questions of cyber strategy. And this is not to downplay the importance of any of the other topics that we've been discussing tonight, the public-private partnership, the need for training and talent development, the need for innovation and understanding, a more subtle explanation of innovation. All of these things are things that we vitally need. But I would just urge us to keep the eye on the ball there. You know, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War and the arguments that went over around the Cold War in academia, where people would fixate on nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are a serious concern. Nuclear weapons were not the problem in the Cold War. The problem in the Cold War was Soviet communism. When Soviet communism changed under Gorbachev, the Cold War ended. And so thinking of that ideological dimension and thinking how that plays out in cyberspace is one thing that we need to not lose focus on.
Very good. Thank you to all. If we were in person right now, you would all be sitting up at the front of the room staring at a sea of hands up in the air. We have which is wonderful that there's so much interest, and the queue of questions is very long. I'm not at all surprised given the quality of your talks and of your chapters. So I'll try my best to go through the Q&A and pick out as many as we can. Please try to keep your answers relatively brief so we can get to as many people as possible. So first up, I have Michael Poznansky chiming in from Pittsburgh, who writes, Dr. Warner, you painted a compelling picture of how the evolution of the threat environment has shaped the way cybercom engages in cyberspace. How, if at all, have other factors, e.g. organizational dynamics, leadership of the institution, shaped the evolution of cybercom and its mission?
Oh my goodness. So how much time do we have left in this session, Josh?
You have 45 seconds.
There we go. There are 2 or 3 books to be written there. There's far more than I can write. It has been a fascinating saga of how a joint organization works with the services and how the leadership has evolved under that. Just to make 2 quick comments on that. Cybercom has been in a very unusual position of having to drive not only cyber operations, but to some extent cyber doctrine, to some extent cyber strategy. Ordinarily, this is not the way it's done in the US military, but what we've done is been able to figure out how to learn from experience and have experience do that. We've also been able to grow a new generation of leaders. We had people coming in, and I've had some of these people talk to me, very senior officers, very smart people coming in and saying, I have no idea why I was picked here. I knew nothing at all about cyber. I didn't even know how to spell the word. But I got in here and I realized I was brought in for my operational background or for some other reason there that fit and filled a need for us. Now we are beginning to have leadership from people who are digital natives in a sense. We've got some very smart people there, but you're going to see within the next 10 years, you're going to see Cyber Command commanded by a man or a woman who's really grown up in this space and spent almost an entire career in cyber issues there, and that will broaden our horizons a little bit there. But a good question. Thank you, Michael.
Well, you went over by 6 seconds, Mike. So I'm afraid that's going on your permanent record. We have a couple of questions now I think are interesting that deal with the international politics of cybersecurity. A lot of our discussion tonight has been about what goes on in the United States institutionally and with public-private collaboration. But I think that our audience is well aware that cyberspace is obviously bigger than the United States, right? The internet is everywhere. So Hannah Chesterton asks, on the international stage, has cooperation between countries in terms of cybersecurity increased over the past decade, or have countries tended to become more isolated in their cybersecurity efforts?
I'd love to take a swing at this first, partially because I love to elevate the work of a tremendous colleague named Rebecca Slayton, who's doing work on computer emergency response teams, and so or CERTs, and her work essentially looks at the very beginning of the threat back in the late 80s, early 90s, and not so much at the state level, right, but at the, although it was at Carnegie Mellon, but certainly very much as a professional courtesy among technically aware people who saw the threat, and the development of teams as they grew. And these teams first sort of were just responding to things like the Morris worm, but over time, it turns out, these emergency response teams and these information sharing and analysis centers all pop up by sector. They all pop up, and by nature of there being sectors, you get international cooperation. You get a lot of information sharing below the state level. You get a lot of CERT teams that travel internationally to help to deal and mitigate with damage done. I think certainly on the defensive side, you see a lot of collaboration. Again, a lot of it is driven by the private sector, or even universities, frankly, have done a lot of the collaborative work. And so I can't speak very strongly to state-on-state strong agreements. I'll have to leave it to my colleagues to talk about that, but certainly across the vast network of those who do cybersecurity at the private sector.
Yeah, I would say on the defense side, the beginning of international engagement was really building off the CSINT relationships that already existed. And there was way more growth that happened building off those CSINT relationships than even building off of traditional alliance relationships. You've seen fits and starts there. One of the kind of big alliance moves that you see now is Hunt Forward, which is the idea of sending US teams to physically go to another country to be able to work with that country to search for bad actors on their own networks. I would say that's a significant maturation and a big change in what was happening before, which was generally kind of like lexicon agreement. I mean, there's a lot of early work that was just like, can we all agree what cyber attack means? And we've moved on past that. But I think what you're seeing is that you're not seeing a normal growth where all of the cyber engagements happening in NATO, or all of the cyber engagements happening with Korea that we already have a strong relationship. Instead, it's very, very event specific based on kind of what our priorities are. And then other countries have, I think domestic politics plays a big role in where we're seeing more productive growth and less, because there are so many unanswered questions about kind of what is appropriate in cyberspace, and then what that intersection is between what is appropriate in cyberspace defense and then kind of privacy and other rules.
Can I just add a quick, I know we're trying to keep it short, but I just wanted to add on Jackie's excellent point about sort of the CSINT Alliance Foundation. And I think another interesting thing you've seen, not on the defensive side, but sort of on the norms and attribution side, is a sort of shared effort to do sort of joint or coordinated attribution, particularly among Five Eyes allies. And so I think that's an area where there is cooperation. I think also on the private sector side, especially financial services, financial institutions are global institutions, and they often have to be responsive not only to, for instance, U.S. regulators, but also other governmental entities around the world. There is I think more of an international collaborative effort there. On the flip side, though, when it comes to norms, I think you've seen a bit of disintegration in sort of traditional international bodies like the UN, with the failure of the group of governmental experts and the sort of fracturing of that into two different tracks. And so really, when you talk about international cooperation, I think is, all of my colleagues have kind of demonstrated, it depends on, how you scope the universe of that and what the issue area is. So it's pretty varied.
Thank you. We've talked about now international cooperation and collaboration. The flip side is international conflict and competition. Patrick Cronin asks, cyber, quote, war seems a reality for an actor like Taiwan. Attacks made in peacetime could enable the use of military attack, e.g. Beijing uses cloud communications to win local support and sap morale to advance unification peacefully, or perhaps with force. Does the Taiwan example suggest that cyber ops before military conflict may be more or as important as cyber operations during a kinetic exchange? In other words, is cyber war won in the preparation?
Can we just say yes? I think we all agree on that, right? I don't know. Yeah, cyber is cyber can be an important shaping tool, right? While luckily the historical record recently of great power conflict is pretty limited. So we haven't really seen cyber play out on the battlefield. And I think, there's been some work, Nadia Kostyuk has done some work on, battlefield dynamics in Ukraine that show maybe it's not quite as useful as we had thought, but certainly I think in the shaping phase, you can make an argument that it is quite significant there, but perhaps my colleagues disagree.
I wouldn't disagree. I would add that there really is no actual shooting conflict anymore that does not also have a cyber dimension. Is probably not pivotal in the same way that air probably isn't necessarily pivotal, or sea power isn't necessarily pivotal, but they fit together there. But I would second the remark about the preparation of the battlefield. Yes, I mean there are situations that one can imagine where the conflict is almost over before the shooting starts, and certainly General Gerasimov in Russia has talked about that publicly beginning in 2013.
You just picked a fight with like half the services, Michael.
Oh, I certainly didn't mean to. I think most of the services would agree with me on that point, but we may want to take this conversation offline.
I was raised that way.
I said, Jackie, speaking for the Air Force, is going to argue for the primacy of air power in all conflicts. I would note, I think it's a terrific and unanswered question that Patrick asks, because we haven't really run the test in a serious conventional fight against modern great powers, right? And hopefully we don't have to run that test, but we do need to think about it, right? And one way of approaching it maybe is not to treat cyber operations as unique and different, but to treat them as a species of counter C2 attacks, and to ask whether or not in a war that kind of attack on an enemy's command and control could have potentially decisive or important effects, as just a first cut at the question. Turning back to the United States, Ian Reynolds asks a question about big bets, but he asks it from the perspective of the private sector. We talk a lot about public-private collaboration from the perspective of the government and how to encourage more collaboration. As Nina pointed out, most of what goes on in cyberspace is innovated and invented and run by the private sector. So we should look at the situation from their eyes. So Ian asks, have you noticed any trends of private cybersecurity companies or government tech development offering cybersecurity solutions designed and marketed as products to stop network intrusions, rather than what may be a more realistic response of designing for resilience? Is there a marketability problem of, quote, we stopped this bad thing from happening, versus, quote, it's going to happen, but we will help you respond? So I'd like to turn this over to Erica for your first take.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I think generally that's accurate. I think that there is understandably, there's kind of like a mental barrier you have to overcome to invest in a resilience approach rather than one based on defense. Because it's sort of not accepting, but sort of assuming that bad things will happen and being prepared for them. And if you're a vendor, cybersecurity vendor, trying to market your product to a potential customer, you're not going to want to package it in a way that says, well, we can't stop the bad stuff, but don't worry. When bad things happen, we'll help you recover. But the problem is that, that's not necessarily, the problem is that defenses aren't perfect, and you can't stop all bad actors. And so, private firms have to do some sort of risk assessment and use that to drive, what % of their cybersecurity budget they should invest in resilient and redundant capabilities rather than focusing only on network defenses. And that will be different for different firms that have different risk profiles and different levels of exposure and things like that. But I do think that's a challenge. But you're seeing the resilience idea pick up more and more. And I would add that a lot of it for financial services is being driven by regulators. And so both in the United States and in the UK, financial regulators have started to come out with best practices around cybersecurity resilience. And so financial institutions anticipating regulatory action are far more likely to make those investments perhaps than in other sectors. But I think you're seeing more uptake on the concept in recent, in the recent past year.
Very good. We have a series of questions about personnel, so I'm gonna point these all towards Jackie, and they're all of a piece. One question is, how serious is the personnel talent shortage? What are the consequences for national security, which you addressed in your comments? What to do about it? What are practical reforms? Again, some of these you mentioned. Maybe you could elaborate a bit more on the way forward. And the last one, maybe the most interesting, if you are a young person, I think Kelsey O'Connor asked this question, and you are thinking about getting into this world, how would you approach it? Right? If you're a talented, say an undergraduate or a master's student, and you're thinking about a career in national security with specific focus on cyberspace, not just how would you get in, but how would you seek to succeed in this business?
Okay, so I'm going to take that question first, because the other ones I could just drone on forever about, like, we need more flexible ways to work. We need less rules about who can work for the DoD. We need to be able to pay people more. How do you actually get into it? And I think there's, there's a few tracks here. I think in general, always having understanding the technology enough to be able to, if your interest is like core NatSec, national security and policy, then you need to understand the technology enough to be able to translate that into policies. So I think taking courses that are, a little bit out of your comfort zone that are maybe more technical is really useful. At Stanford, we have this great classes that Alex Stamos teaches, which gives like a bunch of hands-on, it's not a computer science class per se, but it's like a hands-on class teaching you kind of the core things that you need to know if you're going into, cybersecurity or hacking. So I do recommend like jumping into something like that. I'm older. When I was young, cyber was like not a thing. We just still loved digital technology and we were just downloading everything online. Just, the biggest problem was whether you're gonna like get somebody mad by downloading too much on whatever media platform. So I didn't come to it that direction. I was an intelligence officer in the Air Force, and my first few assignments were really technical. I was a political sciences economics degree in undergrad, and I had to learn about waveforms and the electromagnetic spectrum and the basics of packets and the basics of cryptology. And it pushed me out of my comfort zone. So, I do think the military is a really nice way to push you out of your comfort zone. And then, in kind of like the pragmatics, especially if you're sitting in DC and you're looking for a job, everyone looks at DoD and Cyber Command and NSA, and people forget about DHS and commerce and energy. And there's a whole like huge pool of jobs that are in agencies that are not as that you wouldn't necessarily think of. And that's a really good place to get your first start. Especially because they can help you deal with like the frustrating part of like the clearances. The other thing is you apply for every one of those internships that gives you a clearance. Because starting that process early on will help you get your leg in the door, or that's probably not the right analogy. And then finally, with the cyber accepted service, I think you can actually be by name requested. So the one person that I heard of using this cyber accepted service effectively literally emailed somebody and said, hey, I was in your class, or hey, I saw you in a lecture and I really enjoyed it and I really want to work at Cyber Command, and they were hired that way. And that's the only time I've ever heard of that working. But like, don't be afraid to ask people, especially on the civilian side, to hire you as, for that first gig?
Nina Kollars has done some of the most interesting and path-breaking work on innovation and non-state actors, right? And she's stressed the importance of not treating cyber strategy as simply a nation-state affair, but one conducted by a whole range of industry and firms and other non-state groups. So 2 questions for Nina from the audience, one on innovation and offense and one on innovation and defense. One of our guests tonight asks, quote, on harnessing the role of the private sector, what is the role for regulatory action, perhaps through contractual arrangements to ensure industrial investment and develop of cyber/AI offense capabilities in the context of other state adversaries investing more rapidly? So how would you incentivize innovation on the offensive side from the private sector? And then Audrey Cronin asks, aren't we actually living in a time when digital technologies are accessible to a broad range of people and are not monopolized by the state, i.e. very different from the 20th century? And isn't one lesson of recent months that advanced DoD cyber capabilities can be outflanked both from below and via espionage through the complex supply chain? So we have we're approaching this problem from 2 different directions. How do you encourage more innovation on the offensive side from the private sector? And maybe how do you encourage the private sector to defend itself in ways that are beneficial to everybody?
Okay, wow. So I love both of those questions. And so I'll start from the offensive side, and I'll just try and speak pragmatically. And again, I can't point enough to my colleagues on the screen and say that I think there are a few things that aren't going to change anytime soon, in particular when it comes to offensive stuff in the DoD. DoD is not going to sort of loosen up anytime soon. And so what we should expect in terms of innovation in the offense is we should expect, nobody wants to hear this answer, expansion of DoD contracting. It is a little bit of a misnomer that it's only Microsoft or Google that are leaders in this space. There's also just a huge swath of defense industrial-based providers, normal contractors, Booz Allen Hamilton, BAE, right? They are also increasingly not just really competitive, but some of the best in the space. And you can expect that offensive stuff leveraged by either NSA or DoD is going to those contracts are to be made there because we're worried about the sensitivities, worried about the problems of having a really tremendous O-Day. I hope everyone patched their iPhones, but a tremendous O-Day, right? Get out there and be used by some other state. And so I think for those reasons, you're going to see a lot more, just a stronger, even stronger relationship between the DoD and its traditional industrial-based providers. On the defensive side, I would be remiss, and maybe this is taking the question slightly askew, but I would be remiss if I didn't raise some interesting work being done by DC3, the Defense Crime Center, I think is what DC3 means. And there's a gentleman there named Christopher Johnson who runs the Pentagon's Vulnerability Disclosure Program. The VDP under DC3 is the world's largest vulnerability disclosure program. It has about 2,000 plus hackers globally placed who don't have to be vetted, who we barely know their names, who do defensive vulnerability research for the Pentagon, most of which is free. And so there is some really innovative stuff being done on the defensive side. Are all those hackers well-meaning? Probably not. Does it matter? Maybe not. And so I think there's some really cool and interesting stuff being done to try and be innovative in defense that doesn't involve just rewarding the normal contracting or trying to train people, but essentially just to tap into the global energy to see. Now, I know it's controversial, but it is a model and it does seem to be working, at least for DoD's public-facing websites.
Thank you very much, Nina. I have bad news. We have come to the end of our allotted time, and which is really unfortunate because I have to tell you, we literally have dozens of questions in the queue. And I really feel bad. They're wonderful questions on a range of issues, and I'm sorry that we can't get to them. I've failed you. But the good news is that we will be holding many other events at the Center for Security Innovation and New Technology. This is not an issue that's going away. All of the questions that you've raised about national security and the view from the private sector and how to think about this in the long historical view, as well as in the current issues, the nitty-gritty issues of personnel and resiliency and so forth. These are things that we're all going to be grappling with. So if you're not on our mailing list, please get on our mailing list. We will continue to ask and answer these questions. And if you want to continue the discussion further, please feel free to contact the center offline, and we will keep this discussion going. So it's left to me to thank our panelists once again, Jackie Schneider, Erica Borghard, Michael Warner, and Nina Kollars, for a wonderful discussion. Thank you all in the audience for your participation and for your fabulous questions, and good evening.
Take care.